Session. Our speaker is going to be Jeremy Schmidt, who's now at Dalhousie University, but is moving to Carleton, I guess, this summer, in Ottawa, Canada. He has a very interesting blog called The Anthropocene, and it's on jeremyjschmidt.com. Is that right, the address? So you might want to look at that. And has also edited a very interesting book on water ethics. So, Jeremy, thank you for joining us, and take it away.
Can I just make sure I have everything turned on correctly?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay. Okay, super. Well, thank you very much, everybody. I've really enjoyed the last couple of days, and I hope to draw a little bit and adjust a little bit what I was going to say based on some of the things that I've heard and some of the topics that have been covered already. And starting kind of at the beginning with Rick's introduction to the conference about casting the hook where the memory point of the trout rising is. And in Canada, we don't have that problem. It's always covered in ice. But there's so there's another thing that you can do if you're ice fishing, which I know you can ice fish in Wisconsin, of course, as well. And it's really lovely to have one of the best times to look at a lake be when you cover in all of the light and look straight down the hole that you've bored. It's one of the best views that you can get at the lake. And that's kind of maybe the analogy that I want to look at this talk through. Is through the conference so far, we've had an opportunity to talk about water in lots of different ways, in ways that I think crisscross over multiple senses of what we would call what the word normal can be used to refer to. So sometimes we use the word normal to refer to a social standard, right? They're just a convention that we use to do things like turn off the tap when you're brushing your teeth, right? Sometimes they get much more elaborate, right, in terms of rituals like we got a chance to participate in this morning. Right. Of course, we've talked about more technical aspects of water as well. I mean, it's interesting that the U.S. Geological Survey is the one that handles all of the technical side of water in America, and why there's not a United States Hydrological Survey, for instance, and that's something I'm going to start with today. How did the USGS, as geologists, come to do the hydrology? Right? It's a very interesting historical moment. There's an old-fashioned use of normal that came from a medicinal ratio of salts or solutes in the blood. Don't usually use this one too much anymore, but ecologists do sometimes refer to water as the bloodstream of the biosphere, right? Some notion that water is involved in health is still very much alive. And finally, there is a geological notion of normal where one plate thrusts downward with respect to the other. And I'd like to start sort of there once I do one sort of little preamble in terms of an overview of what I'm going to talk about today. And so that's where this whole project is starting. And what I want to talk about today is how did we come to be able to talk about water in these very normal ways? What are the categories of thought that we're all using to understand water in ways that makes these sorts of conversations and debates coherent? Right? These ways of understanding water didn't come from nowhere. They were specifically crafted, specifically argued for, and specifically instantiated in particular institutions and philosophical ideas, and in the development of a particularly American way of doing social science and doing geology. And it's the intersection of geology and American social science that is really fascinating in crafting this narrative. And this narrative, I'm going to argue, that America has crafted has now been massively influential globally as a result of America's global influence. And I'll try to draw out some of the very specific ways in which this has happened. But first I want to start with something that Hannah Arendt told her class at one of her classes at New York University on opening day one day. Her first words were, "No theories, forget all theories." And what I'm going to argue today is that there's a theory about water management that we need to forget. But it's a theory that is so routinely assented to that I don't think most of us see that we're using it. Right? So what I want to do is elucidate this theory today, just so that we can forget it, but so that we know what we're forgetting. Right? Theory, of course, it's etymologically comes from the word theoria, right? Which is a way of seeing, right? A mental scheme for visualizing what's going on. It's very different than philosophy, right? In terms of the love of wisdom, right? So this way of seeing the world, this way of picturing it, is the one I want to articulate and then help you to forget. So what is that picture? Well, the picture runs roughly like this. And I'll draw on Cynthia Barnett. I wish that she would have been here so she could respond if I get this incorrectly. But in Cynthia's talk, she talked about how we have this notion that water was once abundant, right? And then it became scarce as we didn't manage it correctly. As scarcity intensifies now, and we have increased conflicts over water, then issues arise for water security, whether it's because there's actual interstate conflict, or whether it's the sort of human security where we want water for certain forms of human development. Right? And this notion of this narrative of abundance through scarcity to water security is found in lots of places, not just America. It's found in Canada, it's found in Australia, Brazil, South Africa, Israel, China. This is a very common narrative that we find now at the beginning of many sort of policy preambles. There's several books to this effect by water experts around the world. I won't list the citations, but this is something that we can identify fairly readily with only a few diversions from the general trend. And so what I want to do today is to show sort of how we got this narrative. How did we come to think of water as abundant, scarce, and then as an issue of security? What are sort of the philosophical premises underneath it? Because as it happens, philosophy was really important to this narrative. And a lot of you might wonder whether we can have a philosophy of water management. Right? It's sort of not a normal way to talk about water management. Luna Leopold, who we've talked about already several times, argued in that same speech he gave in 1977 to the Governor's Conference on the California Drought that you couldn't have a philosophy of water management. And his answer to not being able to have one was to have a reverence, to have an ethic. Right? What I'm going to argue today is that we actually do already have one. So Luna Leopold, in this sense, I think, was mistaken. So what I want to do today is show how this picture was propped up by three ideas. And so I put the picture purposely on an easel so that we could have 3 points. I've learned after many church sermons you need 3 points, right? Then you duck and cover and get to the potluck. So there's sort of three areas in which abundance, scarcity, and security have been articulated. And they go along with three particular ways that American water managers have decided or worked upon our understandings of subjectivity, of social goods around water and social characteristics we should support with water, and the symbolic value of water. Right, so these three areas of philosophical interest are what prop up this picture of abundance, scarcity, and security. I'm just going to caution one thing. I'm going to talk about notions of subjectivity, of society, and a bit about symbolic values. But none of these things for American water managers have been justifications. Right? They're not philosophically justifying what they're doing. Rather, they're codifying a particular cultural way of understanding water. Right? And the reason that I'm going to make this distinction is because water management in America was a distinct cultural project that was undertaken by a group of geologists turned anthropologists. There's a name many of you be familiar with. The first director of the USGS was John Wesley Powell. Right? John Wesley Powell's home one evening, a group of other Washington elites, and he decided they ought to form an intellectual club called the Cosmos Club. Well, that's what they named it, right? The Cosmos Club still sits in Washington today, and as this quote from Wallace Stegner, which I just pulled straight off the website, I have the reference if you would like the reference for the quote itself, simply states that the Cosmos Club stood as the closest thing to a social headquarters for Washington's intellectual elite. Right? This was a unique sort of time when the United States government was massively funding science, kind of like Wisconsin right now. Or Canada, right? So the different bureaucracies, the USGS, the Bureau of Education, a number of them were publishing the leading journals such as Science, National Geographic, American Anthropologist. All of these journals started coming out of these groups of thinkers. And one of the distinct problems that they were interested in was confronting what they called laissez-faire metaphysics. So they kind of used this term laissez-faire metaphysics to identify two things they didn't like. The first was the laissez-faire resource capitalism of the American frontier in the 19th century. After the 1890 publication by Frederick Turner on the end of the American frontier, there was sort of a rapid concern that laissez-faire capitalism just couldn't keep going, that we need to sort of corral it somehow. So the laissez-faire philosophies of resource extraction were of prime concern to them, right? But they were also very concerned about a set of metaphysical problems that had to do with what sort of person were resources to be stewarded for. And this is where the notion of abundance sort of comes in. Now, the notion of abundance, it wasn't tied for them to things like, biblical floods or Greek battles between Gaia and chaos, where Gaia's ordered earth comes forth out of the disordered water. Right? Rather, what they wanted to do was tie a view of abundance to geology. They thought if we could have a geological view through and through, without metaphysics at all, just with science, that we could link up the American people to the evolution of the earth. So this is their goal, right? And so to have this goal, the first thing they do is they confront the notion of the subject that was very common in 18th and 19th century philosophy, particularly the one that came through Kantian philosophy. And I'm sure that the students who are in the room who came here on a Saturday, this is exactly what you wanted to hear, a quick update on Kant, who divided, of course, our phenomenal experiences, say of rain falling on our heads and our experiences of wetness and coldness, from things in themselves. What these geologists turned anthropologists claimed was that, Kant really had solved the wrong kind of problem. Right? Because what Kant had been trying to solve was a set of problems where there was mind and there was matter. Right? And they said, well, what if we had a different kind of stuff to start with? What if the universe was made of stuff that was both mind and matter? Then we wouldn't have to try to fix this dualism right off the bat. And so this is what they tried to do. They had this notion of earth stuff. This is exactly what they called it, earth stuff, so very technical. Right? And it was this earth stuff they held that had to have a very, very small amount of capacity for consciousness, even in the smallest atom. And then as atoms came together and evolved over geological time, things became more complex, and as more matter came together, the capacity for consciousness went up and up and up and up, and soon we had the capacity for consciousness. Then we had the capacity for a self-realization about consciousness and an ability to study human societies. That was anthropology. So it was this very nice way of saying anthropology is the best science, right? Because it was the one that was going to reflect on human societies itself, all based in this view of the earth stuff that came through geological time. Now, they had several reasons to do this. Right? One was the laissez-faire capitalism. One was that they also didn't like social Darwinism, which was the view that societies should compete and the competing societies win, or within societies we should compete and sort of that's the way it works. They thought this view was really wrong, right? For one reason, they thought that the leading articulator of social Darwinism, Herbert Spencer, had made a norm out of evolutionary chance. Right? They thought this is not, evolution is a chance outcome, so giving an advantages in it or winning in an evolutionary contest makes a normative claim about a winner that is just the result of chance circumstances that position somebody in a place where they could beat somebody in something. But they also had a deeper claim, because one of Spencer's key ideas was that he took the liberal notion of individual persons, of individual people and their freedom to act, and he naturalized it into a relationship between an organism and its environment. In fact, the very word environment comes from Herbert Spencer and his social Darwinist philosophy in the late 19th century. So before that time, no one used the word environment like we use it today. Right? And there wasn't a single organism's relationship to the environment. Right? If we read Darwin, we see environments, we see circumstances, always in the plural. And because Spencer had this view, his view in short was that you can make individuals discrete, then they can compete. Well, these geologists and anthropologists wanted to counter that view by saying there is no single organism because we've all evolved together. As we've evolved, we've changed the world in which we live, so we have created a shared environment, right? So we are interdependent. Right? This, loosely speaking, is their view. It was a little bit more cryptic in some senses, a little bit more full of jargon. But to make this all fly, they had to do a couple of things. The first thing they had to do was they had to expand what counted as geology, right, to include humans. So the very first thing you do if you're a 19th century social scientist is you reclassify things, right, particularly if you're in the government. So what they did, this is an 1890 classification by somebody named William John McGee, who was a key geologist in the USGS under Powell. What he did is he said, look, we'll just start on the left of this chart. There's geological phenomenon, and then we can classify them all out. These include, I'm just going to go up to the left because that's where we're going to get to people. So geological things act, right? And as we go up, there's processes and they have motion, then there's sort of a molar mass. And by the time we get over to the right, we find that there's all kinds of things that can be geological. And the twist that these geologists made was to say, usually we think about geology as what's laid down over time, right? That was the standard definition of geology at the time. And they simply said, look, we need to expand the definition of geology to include anything that can act on the surface, right? To include processes of degradation in addition to those of sedimentation, right? And once you do that, if you don't have these Kantian ideas in the background, then anything that changes the surface of the Earth is a geological agent, right? So it's not just Kantian individuals or liberal individuals walking around doing things. Anything can be an agent, right? There's an abundance of subjects in the world. And of those, water was the most important because every other form of life needed water. So the key point for them then was to come up with a way of managing this abundance through the management of water. Right? It's a coherent but very weird view that they were developing at the time. Now, a second reason that they wanted to develop this, I don't want to belabor it too much, but a second reason that they wanted to develop this point was because at this time, American social scientists really wanted to distinguish themselves from British social scientists, right? And they interpreted Herbert Spencer as sort of representative of British thought, and they critiqued the social institutions, particularly the institution of property that the British had brought over to America as being totally disconnected from the environmental conditions that America had evolved within. Right? So the institution of property, they thought, was a result of colonial rule that Britain had imposed onto the US. And so they thought, in order to get past this, what we need to do is naturalize the US Constitution in order to make sure that the institutions that manage our most important resources like water are grounded in a theory and in a view of geology and of planetary evolution itself. Indeed, the entire cosmos, which is why they named their club the Cosmos Club. Right? So this is sort of very expansive view. And so to give you an example of how they did this and how they linked the sort of naturalization of the Constitution to the rejection of colonial history, here's a quote that comes from a 1911 argument. I'll just read it out in case there's people at the back who maybe are a bit too distant. This comes from a person named William J. McGee, who I'll describe a bit more and why he was important in 1 second. But McGee argued that as the prime necessity of life, the ultimate basis of existence for each of the individuals united in the nation, the water of the country is, under the leading principle of our national existence that all men are equally entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the common and individual possession of all, a possession that's in equity, inalienable, and indefeasible, since no constituent of the nation, no person, can alienate or divest himself of his share without surrendering his life and so weakening the nation. Right? So here is one of the very early instances of creating the public right in water and tying it to the security and strength of the American state. Right? Because none of us can divest our share and our ownership of water without surrendering our life, and that will weaken the state overall. Right? No people, no state. So this was McGee's view, and this McGee Fellow, not very well known for someone who is very, very influential. He was born in Iowa in a farmhouse, moved to Washington to work at the USGS under Powell. When Powell created the Bureau of Ethnology, which subsequently was key to sort of the settlement of the West as they went around and studied all of the indigenous cultures in the West and then told people back in Washington what to do with them in very patriarchal and domineering ways. McGee was very much a part of this. Right? He was key to establishing American anthropology. He, together with Franz Boas, actually founded the American Association of Anthropology. He was on the founding board of National Geographic. He wrote some of the first articles that come in that. He wrote often in Science and in other publications. It's one of the advantages of being in Washington at this time, right? If you write it, it gets published. So you have a typewriter, lots of other people don't. It's very convenient. But he was also, more than anything else, the father of two, as much as anybody can be the sort of the father of ideas, he was the person who came up with the ideas of conservation and of multi-purpose river basin planning in America, more than anybody else. Right? He was the guiding force behind Teddy Roosevelt's understanding of conservation. Gifford Pinchot actually credits McGee with convincing him of the extended utilitarian principle that guides the U.S. Forest Service, the greatest good for the greatest number for the longest time. That evolutionary extension was McGee's. Right? McGee was the one who in 1907 brought together, for the first time, every congressperson, every senator, all the Supreme Court justices, and the president on the Conference of National Resource Conservation in the US. Right? He was a secretary to that meeting. He also wrote Teddy Roosevelt's speeches for it, which is all very convenient if you want to get your ideas out there. So this person was very influential. He went on to become the secretary of the Inland Waterways Commission, which at the time was the most important resource planning commission in America. And he came up with his ideas actually one day on the Mississippi when they were debating whether they should put a deep water port in at St. Louis. And it was there that he realized that we should develop watersheds as a complete unit, right? Because these were the units in which American society was evolving, right? So if we wanted to protect the evolutionary prospects of America, we need to manage these units as an ecological whole. Right? This was his basic view. So this very idea of the watershed is tied to politics, right? It's not necessarily something that's natural at all. It's a very political idea to manage things by watersheds, particularly in American thought. Now, Powell had passed away in 1902. McGee passed away actually in the Cosmos Club in 1912. After that, their ideas kind of waned. And there was quite a bit of division in terms of specialization in the sciences, right? So you couldn't really keep going with these grand collections of philosophy, geology, anthropology, geography, all this stuff. People didn't buy it anymore, right? There's a differentiation. One final really funny note about McGee. I mentioned that they wanted to naturalize institutions like property. So McGee had a solution for this. He suggested that Americans, who were using the gold standard for economics at that time for their monetary supply, exchange the gold standard for the water standard. And the way to do this was to calculate the value of property based on the gold standard, take the 7-year annual runoff for rainfall, and connect that same amount of money that is now in gold into that amount of water. It's about $3 an acre foot. It's about what it was worth in 1909. So very, very thorough, right, if deeply ethnocentric and problematic, right? Because nowhere in this space are there any other cultures except for Americans, right? The Americans in this model are the pinnacle of evolution, right? And resources are to be conserved to ensure the abundance of a liberal American democracy. That's the whole point of them, right? Conserved in the long run to support the state. Now, as I mentioned, these ideas kind of all wane, but they come roaring back. Oh, he also said, so there's so much about this guy that's so interesting, I forgot. He also did this, right? So he thought the moment of the constitutional utterance of we the people was an age of mysticism and metaphysics giving way to a more humane foundation for government. He also claimed that what we needed to do as a founding principle was to establish equal rights of present and future generations to the resources of a country. Right? And I want to flag this, because this is one of the earliest notions of sustainability that is tied directly to conservation. And by the time we get to sustainable development, American ideas of conservation are very important to the institutional development of things like the USAID, to the International Hydrological Decade that we talked about already today. There's a thread of thoughts through all of this that start here, right? And that thread is to get from the many cultural worlds that we have to a single view of the Earth, right? That's what the Brundtland Commission asked us to do in 1987, right? Get from many worlds to one Earth. That's sustainability. Anyways, back to the 30s. Wisconsin was so important at this time, particularly in the creation of the Tennessee Valley Authority, which under the New Deal, so through the 20s there was specialization in the disciplines, sort of a good run of capitalism for the decade, and kind of came to a crashing halt, as everybody knows. And in the 1930s, they're looking, Teddy Roosevelt's cousin, the other Roosevelt, is looking for something to spur the economy. And the Tennessee Valley Authority becomes very important. We've talked about Leopold a lot already. Leopold declined the offer to be the lead forester at the TVA. But one of the first directors of the Tennessee Valley Authority was David Lilienthal, who at the time was the chair of the Public Utilities Commission in Wisconsin. Previous to that, he had written this bill that I know Wisconsinites will want to remember, which was the Railway Labor Act of 1926 that created the basis for union representation by industrial workers in America. So this really sort of fascinating history that Wisconsin can bring in this regard as well. Now, okay, so that's sort of one aside. The Tennessee Valley Authority was a very contested and very interesting attempt to create a federal institution that would manage water for the best interest of the American people. And I'm not going to get into all of the details of the contest or the politics over the TVA itself. What I want to focus on instead is how this understanding became a model for international development. Right? This particular way of linking the state to the management of a watershed harkened back to those initial ideas of McGee and of Powell, but brought them into sort of a more modern phase, well, modern in 1930s at least. Now, David Lilienthal himself expressly linked his ideas to conservation. For him, the TVA, the conditions for it were set by the early conservationists. But it's here that the notion of scarcity starts to creep in. Because you cannot manage water to create all kinds of opportunities, right? And one of the interesting problems that came about at this time was that the TVA was designed specifically as a process of modernization to counter modernization that was going on in Russia. So Russia was modernizing heavily, and the American government said, we need to modernize heavily because we need to have institutions that can create certain sorts of opportunities that are beneficial for the US people. Right? And so this comes at a big expense, right? Because when there's about 33 dams in this watershed, and every time you dam the river, you stop abundance, right? And the only way that water is let through the gate is to create a kind of abundance that fits with a certain vision of liberal opportunities. Right? So the equality of opportunity in America, which is a fundamental value of liberal democracy in this country, is built to a large degree on having the conditions upon which to pursue opportunities. And those include things like electricity, water, all the sorts of things that the TVA was designed to provide. Now, as it happened, the TVA was also really, really influential in providing enough energy for things like the development of the atomic bomb, and it became enrolled in American notions of security itself, and which persisted well into the Cold War. And of course, I'm just giving you the narrative arc here rather than all the details of precisely who and how this happened, but these are all things that I've tracked out. Now, once we see this, the TVA in sort of this geopolitical context, one of the most interesting components of it comes out in that because the TVA was seen as a way to develop water in support of American liberalism, it was seen as a ripe opportunity to use as a model for international development. Right? So why don't we just go and create TVAs all around the world? We'll be helping people get more water, developing electricity, and so on, right? And at the same time, they'll be managing water in a way that fits with American liberalism. Right? And this argument was made very specifically to Lyndon Johnson by David Lilienthal and another advisors of Johnson's, based on this argument. And the argument went like this. When Britain colonized the United States, it created dependent relationships between the financial centers in the east and north, Washington, Boston, New York, and the resource hinterlands of the south and west. Right, so the hinterlands kept throwing all of their resources out to the financial centers, and they were the ones where all the profit was getting. And this unequal relationship was something that the TVA confronted by developing an entire region at once in a particularly American way. Right? So, by parity of faulty reasoning, if Americans had countered colonial relationships through regional development, why couldn't we just take this notion of regional development and put it in every post-colonial context around the world? Right? Well, it's very faulty logic, right? Because it was not the colonized that came up with the TVA, right? It was a subset of colonizers that established American independence, right? Not the colonized indigenous people of North America, right? So it's an extremely misguided analogy, right? But this was the analogy that was convincing of the day. And importantly, the TVA was the model that was taken up by UNESCO, by USAID. James Scott, the Yale political scientist, has argued that you can't think development without thinking the TVA in the mid-20th century. That's how influential the model of institutional design was. So, of course, there's a bit of a problem with this, right, is that not everywhere is America. So there's a quick recognition that the American story about water just simply couldn't be the global story, right? So very shortly into the 1960s, as we talked about this morning, there was a project called the International Hydrological Program. Right? The IHD ran from 1965 to 1975, and it was through this decade that a natural connection between local water problems and the global water cycle was created. Right? And the IHD was heavily funded by UNESCO And the United States was key to providing resources for that project, in part because several American senators were arguing that there's a massive water famine coming to America in the 1950s and 1960s. And that what we needed to do then was to find a way to connect what they called, local problems, right, with sort of the global system, right? So to scale between the local and the global in a way that naturalized what these problems look like. Right? So this was led by several key people. There were several key Russian hydrologists that provided a lot of the data for UNESCO during this period. But one of the key articulators of the International Hydrological Decade's findings about hydrology was a senior hydrologist at the USGS, Raymond Nace, who had worked with Luna Leopold previously. Raymond Nace's arguments, this is sort of his report, this is the title, right? Water and Man, a World View. Right? Not water and many societies and multiple ways of thinking about the earth, no. Right? This is a way to connect one particular understanding and one set of problems to a global picture, a global imagination of the earth itself through a particular way of doing hydrological science. Now at the time, hydrology is not a professionalized discipline. Right? Hydrology really comes into its own in the 60s and 70s as a discipline that is the sort of scientific discipline that we know now. And we find lots of quick rewritings of the history of hydrology. Oh, did you know has been hydrology going on for a long, long, long time? Right? All these histories come out in the 1970s, particularly the one I'm thinking of was written by Asit Biswas. Now, one of the most important things to come out of this is that the global, well, that's getting ahead of myself. I'm going to show a problem first. Now, to create this global local link requires some key assumptions that are deeply ethical and that we should really consider, right? The first thing that you have to do to be able to go from a small scale to a larger scale is have uniform units, right? Anyone who's built, there's lots of university students, I'm sure you've built houses out of milk crates and all this kind of stuff, but whatever you can get together, right? You have to have things that are of the same size to put them together, like Legos or whatever, right? If you want to be able to go up. And another thing that has to happen is as you go up in scale, there can't be any change in relationships, right? So you can't have emergent properties that weren't predictable from the smaller units, right? You're not scaling then. Then you have an emergent system. It's very different, right? So if you want to have a production line that can produce massive amounts of things in a factory, for instance, you have to have the sorts of things that can come together in ways that don't surprise you at the end. Right? So this way of scaling things from the local to the global forces us to make some sorts of assumptions about the kinds of things that we're scaling. And we have to produce an understanding of water in this case to be able to scale it between the local and the global. Right? And what I'm arguing is that this understanding comes through a particular way that an American tradition of water management has itself produced in order to support American liberalism and different iterations of American liberalism. So, and we're all sort of familiar with this now. Right? This is the USGS model of water scarcity that came out last year, and we're all very used to now seeing there's lots and lots of salt water, there's not very much fresh water, that's the little dot beside the bigger one. And then I put the arrow there because, the very smallest dot is the amount that we're allowed, that is available for human use, right? So here's the way that we construct the understanding of scarcity, right? Through the practice of hydrology. Right? So our understanding of scarcity then isn't something natural at all. It's a political judgment about the way to represent the world. In fact, when water was declared scarce in 1977 at the UN conference in Mar del Plata, they just said it. It's scarce. It wasn't until 1989, 12 years later, that any even remotely agreed upon metric for water scarcity was in use. Right? So we didn't start measuring water and then all of a sudden come to the conclusion that it's scarce. We declared it scarce. Then we found ways to measure scarcity. Right? So this is a very important difference in how we understand the conceptual development that goes on around water. So the IHD ends in 1975. Oh, sometimes I get going ahead of my notes here. Oh, yes. So it ends in 1975. 2 years later, there's the first UN Conference on Water in Argentina in 1977. Out of that, the first water atlas that was produced by the International Hydrological Decade is turned into a global assessment of water. That global assessment of water becomes the basis for international water policy in sustainable development in Rio de Janeiro, and then with modifications in the 1990s into contemporary policy today. Right? So this tradition of understanding the hydrological cycle is the one that gets carried through now. So I'm only going to go for a few more minutes. So now let's quickly summarize. In the late 19th century, we had a notion of conservation that came out of American anthropology and its leanings towards geological understandings of the Earth. Right? We had sort of a forgetful period where when it was recovered through the TVA became a model of development, right? A development that was in large part designed for various Cold War purposes of international development to prevent, to secure peace, right? And then by the 1980s, we see a merger of these two same ideas, or these two things of economic development and resource conservation under the banner of sustainable development, right? So this notion of resource abundance and resource scarcity come together in an era of sustainability about how are we going to secure ourselves on this ever-threatened planet, right? What are we going to do about the precarious state of the biosphere and of, species extinction, of groundwater pollution, and so on and so forth. So in a way, we've done what the early American water managers wanted us to do. We've found a way to get from a whole bunch of worlds that were metaphysically dark and confused, other, yet to be colonized people, and we've got everybody on board with a particular understanding of the Earth, right? And of course, the key now is to hide that understanding of the Earth actually came out of one of those worlds, right? We need it to look objective, right? We need it to look like it's not a cultural understanding or a cultural production, right? And to do that, we have to do quite a bit of symbolic violence to various alternative ways of understanding water, of understanding its relationship to society, of understanding its relationship to traditions, to other species. And that is sort of the place in which we're at today, right? Is this moment of trying to understand an idea of water security that suggests, well, we messed up with abundance, right? Then water became scarce, and now it's insecure somehow. And so that is sort of the narrative that we now use as a general backdrop for talking about water management, right? And this is shot through with deep ethical and political considerations. And I think that about covers what I was hoping to say. Oh, yeah, no, it's not. Okay, great. I was like, it seemed like a weird place to end. But I knew I had some other more nuanced thing. Maybe not more nuanced, but. So I talked a little bit about Leopold, and one of the things that I want to do is, about Luna, is come back then to Luna's father, Aldo, right? Because in the day after the American Dust Bowl was declared, Aldo Leopold delivered a speech called Land Pathology at the University of Wisconsin. And there, Leopold argued that while we can't put the relationship between society and the land into a test tube, we do have evidence regarding the accelerating velocity of destructive interactions, end quote, of mechanized resource extraction. The American experience, although Leopold argued, was unmistakable and probably unprecedented in the aegis of cultural history because the changes it wrought happened rapidly enough to correlate them with human action. right? Especially climate change, he argued. I know you're not supposed to say this too much anymore. But one of Leopold's key insights that he then went on to make was that it wasn't, and this is an ethical claim, was that it wasn't necessarily the anthropocentrism or the unique claim about human values that was a problem in environmental or management policies, right? This is something that environmental ethicists have been arguing about for decades, right? Although Leopold didn't think anthropocentrism was that big of a problem, right? He actually thought that lots of cultures had probably thought they were cosmologically unique, right? The problem, he thought, was with cultures that destroyed things in geological time, right? And I think what we want to do is we want to counterpose the geological ways of thinking of conservation that were in vogue when Leopold was trained at Yale, right, with the ecological mode of thinking that he wanted to develop. In specific, the idea of social and ecological evolution going through time from a geological perspective was one that Leopold specifically countered with a set of spatial claims. Right? He said that we need to learn to think at right angles to evolution and perpendicular to Darwin. Right? That we need to think spatially, right, rather than just temporally. And he used the Marshland Elegy as one of the best examples of this, where he calls the return of the swans the ticking of the geological clock. Right? So the geological clock ticks spatially, and it ticks ecologically, not just as a linear movement through time, right? Not just as the progress, say, of American notions of conservation. Thanks. Yeah, well, I think we have maybe we started a little late, so I think we have a time for a few questions. Okay, there's one here and then here.
Jerry, I love it and the development and the detail of it. The TPA, this is for my question. I'm wondering how that was used to formulate the way the Columbia Basin was developed. There's probably very close relationships. But my main question was this: you started out with metaphysics, and were you implying that Kant is the summit or the end of philosophy of epistemology and metaphysics?
No, that's a really good question, actually. So, and that wasn't very clear in what I said. Thanks. The reason that these folks were so interested in distancing themselves from Kant was that they thought that after Kant's philosophy, and then as it was taken up in Hegel's historicism, was all part and parcel with colonialism, with colonial ideas, right? So to reject all of those ideas, they said, let's reject this historical notion of philosophy as basically one cultural way of understanding things, and then we'll just talk about evolution, right? We'll just use the geological sciences. So for instance, this gap between phenomenon and thing, right, between reality as I experience it and reality as it is. Right? Yeah. So they said that space between those two things was the scientific equivalent of the occult. Right? This was a carryover, a hangover of the dualism of mind and matter. Right? You just made a nice philosophical argument about how to bridge this gap, but the problem is that the gap is an old metaphysical idea that we don't need anymore. It's not scientific. Right? So that was what they wanted to do. Right? That's why they wanted to leave that behind. Yes?
You mentioned the two coordinates, time and space, or place. Maybe even that's outdated now. We need more coordinates than that, not just time and space. In the 21st century, maybe there is something else that's, we would call it metaphysical or spiritual, that's entering into that, that's making more of a holistic view where there's not just 2 points like local, global, mind, matter, energy. It could be some other things that we need to put in there that explains complexity and emergent properties, and we should be going there and not trying to have, this old model of that we can produce things out of units and standardize that. That was the industrial revolution. But we're way beyond that with the digital and the virtual and the quantum, so maybe that needs to be in there as well. Have you thought about something for this age right now?
Yeah, so I agree with you that we need some account of emergent properties, right? And what I've given today is a diagnosis of why we don't have those, right? This is the tradition in which we still think about water, right? So my attempt to diagnose sort of the extent to which we bought into this picture of abundance and scarcity and security is precisely to draw out these kinds of questions, right? To say, well, we need to rethink the ways that properties emerge in complex systems, right? That aren't these scaled units where relationships are linear over time. I agree with this sort of thinking. As far as where to go from that, maybe we could talk about it afterwards, just so we could field a few more questions. But I agree. I think this is something that we need to take very seriously. Is the complex and emergent systems? Yeah. If there's one here and then to you after, is that okay?
Oh no. So there are two issues with this sort of thing. One of them is the unifying aspect, and the other one is that the unifying aspect is one that has a particular history that we may want to question. But those are different sorts of problems and need to be separated, because I take it the unifying theoretical thing is a feature of scientific reasoning generally, and so challenging that is, I can see people reading that as a potential challenge to science. That's important. But I'm assuming you don't want to do that.
That's one question.
Yeah.
Is that a full question?
Yeah, well, I take it that that matters more. Well, yeah, let's just start with that one.
Okay, well, I think first of all, we should situate science in the social conditions in which science is produced, right? The state has given the resources and the tools for things like hydrology, for anthropology, for geography, geology, right? The state positions certain resources and affects the way we do science all the time, right? It cuts funding for things, it funds other things, right? So I think we want to keep the scientific production of our understandings of the Earth in the context of the social conditions through which we pursue them, right? I think this is the whole field of science and technology studies. This is part of the entire sort of genre of research and scholarship. So I'm okay with challenging the unifying project of the sciences, right? Some people think you can unify things, right? Other people don't. But that's a scientific debate in the philosophy of science as well. There's lots of differences between the commensurability between different types of knowledge. Some people hold out for unifying theories. Other people think, well, maybe we can't do that. It depends who you're talking to in the sciences themselves. So I'm okay with letting this sit uncomfortably for myself. At the back, there was a question.
Yeah, I'm a Ho-Chunk tribal member. I'm a deer climb member, and I've actually studied some of this stuff, and I'm really surprised that you would actually make like the Tennessee Valley Association kind of like a leader or a model, because I know in December 11th, 2008, they made one of the biggest environmental spills. Coal ash, and it affected a lot of people. A lot of people had breathing problems. It killed hundreds of fish. And I really don't see the Tennessee Valley Association trying to help anybody out there, because Tennessee doesn't even notice that the coal ash is not a pollutant.
Yeah.
So I mean, really, when you, I started hearing the Tennessee Valley Association. I'm sorry, but I really don't back up, and I don't think that they're a model.
Yeah,
I'd rather look at a beaver and think a beaver is more of a model than Tennessee Valley Association.
Well, I mean, as a Canadian with a national animal as the beaver, I completely agree with you. What I was trying to show was that it was a certain set of American policymakers who made the TVA the example. I mean, I think this is an incredibly flawed model. Right? I'm in full agreement with you. The thing that I wanted to point out was that this is the model that has been very, very influential. And I think this is the sort of model that we need to reject precisely on the sorts of grounds that you're suggesting. Right? These attempts...
I really do think that they need to speak more than the Native Americans that have been on this continent for way longer than a couple hundred years.
I'm in complete agreement with this as well.
they were talking about mining the other day at a zoning meeting that I went to, and nobody asked the Ho-Chunk Nation about land that they got right next to them, and that they're actually trying to build a sand mine.
Yes.
And we found out later on that they actually were taking sand out and selling it, and they didn't even have permits for it. So, you know, so you kind of makes you wonder just what the government's got going sometimes, so.
I agree, and
That's all I'm saying.
if I could take from this point to whatever the next question is, I really like the point that you're making. I'm sorry, I don't know your name, but the idea here that there is one group set up who's going to speak for everybody, right? That the government has the sort of public backing, right? As I tried to show at the beginning, the notion that there is an American people that water is designed to support of, right, is a completely ethnocentric claim, right? It privileges American colonizers over all of the indigenous people of Turtle Island, right? So, and it's become then ingrained in exactly the sorts of institutions and decisions about mining, about resource extraction, about fishing, about hydropower, about land use, about agriculture, all of forestry. All of these things then require or position state bureaucracies and state decision makers in the position of power, right? Which is, at least in Canada, where I'm from, Treaty 7 territory, this was not the basis of agreements for treaties at all. This was not the way they were negotiated for sharing land or resources or anything, right? So these sorts of things, these deeply colonial mindsets are what I want us to help get out of. And these sort of narratives of abundance, scarcity, and security leave those colonial assumptions in place, right? Yes?
Do you consider the Alberta tar sands as sort of the present-day evolution of the TVA?
Well, I want to consider it the evolution of the TVA, no. Mostly because there is no water management to speak of in the tar sands. Right? So there's not really a lot going on. I did my doctoral dissertation work on water management in Alberta. I spent a fair amount of time there. I grew up there, actually. So no, I don't. In northern Alberta, it is just profligate resource extraction. Right?
There's a lot of water mismanagement there.
Oh yeah, sure. Right. But the TVA is a structure that attempts to manage the entire watershed together. And in the Athabasca River, that is not the Athabasca watershed where the tar sands are, there is a water planning and advisory committee called the Athabasca Water Planning and Advisory Committee, but it has no regulatory authority. It's a body that meets, sets policies, makes recommendations to a provincial bureaucrat who then can decide yes or no on those recommendations, or can hear from any other actor that happens to contact them outside of this informal water planning and advisory committee. So it's not a comparable case, no. But there are deep, of course, water management problems in the tar sands. Yeah. I see Rick rising for...
Yeah, I think we have to wrap this one up. Just, do you have a final word?
Let's go in the sun eventually.